Hello, everyone. My name is Emily. I am the co-chair of the Hart House Student Literary and Library Committee. We'd like to thank you for joining us this evening for Black Voices in CanLit with speakers Jael Richardson, Ian Williams, and Dr. Andrea Davis, and moderated by Catherine Grant. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the Hart House and the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work and write on this land. I encourage everyone to take a moment to reflect upon your relationship with the land and the Indigenous people who live on the land, wherever you might be in the world. We're grateful to be speaking about Black voices and Black artists in Canadian literature during Black History Month, and to contribute to Hart House's programming around Black futures through the perspective of literature. We're exploring the idea of Afrofuturism as a way to blend the knowledge of the past with a reimagining of the future. It is a showcase of intersectional arts and dialogue, which aims to reflect the experiences of today's Black leaders and artists. There is a rich tradition of Afrofuturism as a genre and style in literature, from Samuel Delaney's Dahlgren, published in 1975, and Octavia Butler's Kindred, published in 1979, to N.K. Jamison's The Fifth Element, published in 2015, including our speakers today and hopefully emerging writers in the audience. The term Black futures, as described by Ingrid Lafleur, refers to the imagining of possible futures through the Black cultural lens, to imagine, conceive, and write stories and futures from the Black cultural lens. And I particularly like this quote from John Jennings in the New York Times. The mountaintop that Dr. King spoke about does not exist in this universe. It's an imaginary construct of what the future could be. We hope that through this event, we'll be able to explore, promote, and celebrate Black futures and creativity as a community. There will be two themes spoken about over the course of these 2 hours. First, Black storytelling as a career path, and second, the Black artist and future of Black Canadian writing. We'll take a break at the halfway mark around 6 p.m. We encourage dialogue and active participation with the speakers and the content of their discussion. To pose a question to our speakers, please use the chat function located at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom toolbar. We endeavor to get as many questions answered as possible, and we'll monitor the chat. Please remain muted unless explicitly called on by the speakers. Again, we encourage everyone to pose questions through the chat so as not to derail the conversation. Inappropriate comments or speaking out of context by any participant will result in the individual privately being asked to stop the inappropriate commenting. And if they do not, we will have to remove the individual from the event to ensure the integrity and intent of the space is kept. We remind everyone to engage in respectful dialogue in the chat. And before I pass the metaphorical mic to our moderator, Catherine, I'd like to introduce our speakers formally and thank them for participating in Black Voices in CanLit. Dr. Andrea Davis is an associate professor in Black Cultures of the Americas in the Department of Humanities at York University. She is currently special advisor of the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies' Anti-Black Racism Strategies. She holds cross appointments in the graduate programs in English, Interdisciplinary Studies, Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies, and Social and Political Thought. Her research focuses on the literary productions of Black women in the Americas. She's particularly interested in the intersections of the literatures in the Caribbean, the United States, and Canada, and her work encourages an intertextual, cross-cultural dialogue about Black women's experiences in diaspora. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Horizon, Sea, Sound, Caribbean and African Women's Cultural Critiques of Nation. Ian Williams is the author of the novel Reproduction, the winner of the 2019 Giller Prize, Personals, shortlisted for the Griffin Poetry Prize and the Robert Crouch Poetry Book Award, Not Anyone's Anything, winner of the Danuta Gleed Literary Award, and You Know Who You Are, a finalist for the Relit Prize for Poetry. In 2020, he published his latest poetry collection, World Problems, and in fall 2021, he will release Disorientation, the Experience of Being Black in the World. Williams is an associate professor of English at U of T. He completed his doctorate in English here under George Eliot Clark, and he also spent 4 years teaching poetry at UBC. Jael Richardson is the author of The Stone Thrower, a book columnist on CBC's Q, and the founder and executive director for the Festival of Literary Diversity, Fold, in Brampton, Ontario. Her debut novel, Gutter Child, is a dystopian tale of courage and resilience and arrived January 2021 with HarperCollins. We'd also like to give a big thanks to Catherine Grant for moderating this event on our behalf. Catherine is a first-year Canadian history PhD student. She wrote her MA at York on the dark side of the Canadian dream, a history of housing discrimination in Toronto from 1961 to 1977. She is currently working on a comparative analysis of Jamaican community organizing and culture in Birmingham and Toronto. She likes to write poetry that grapples with her diasporic identity, and reading Black Canadian literature as a youth inspired her to become a historian. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Catherine to start off the first theme for this evening, Black storytelling as a career path.
Thank you, Emily. I look forward to having a fruitful conversation with you. We have a renowned Black Canadian academic, award-winning authors and poet on the panel. I implore you to ask questions and take the opportunity to tap into their vast knowledge. Our stories are so important. I am here today only because of those who stood before me. I would like to thank my grandmother for passing on Anansi's stories. I'd like to thank my parents for teaching me about Black history, from Marcus Garvey to Queen Nanny to Black Canadian heroes such as Marianne Shadd and Elijah McCoy. I'm so proud to be part of this vital conversation. The writing craft and writing is difficult work, so I hope to stimulate somewhat of a seminar experience. I have a few questions prepared, but I would like to focus on the questions that the audience has. I know a lot of you are burgeoning creatives and writers, and we'll have questions for our amazing panelists. So without further ado, I will go ahead and start the questions. Ronaldo Walcott noted that regardless of national origins for Black Canadians, quote, Blackness is at the center of their Canadianness. To be Black at home in Canada is both to belong and not belong. Located between the United States and in the Caribbean, Canadian Blackness is a bubbling brew of desires for elsewhere, disappointments in the nation, even for those who have resided here for many generations. End of quote. Black Like Who, Writing Black Canada, page 135. I would like to just use this quote as a generative touchstone. I know from reading a lot of your work that all of you, your work grapples with Black Canadian identity in some sort of respect. So I'd like to just start with Professor Davis asking the question, how does your writing address your identity or Blackness in the Canadian experience?
My apologies there. My apologies. I'm now unmuted. So thank you so much, Catherine and Emily and the other organizers, for inviting me to join this panel and to think with Ian and Jael and you, Catherine, around some of these really important questions. In my forthcoming book, Horizon Sea Sound, Caribbean and African Women's Cultural Critiques of Nation, I talk about questions of diaspora, belonging, and placemaking through the trope of the horizon, which I think is a really powerful signifier of Black people's and Black women's movement and relationship to space and place and the Canadian nation. So, through the trope of the horizon, I consider the ways in which Caribbean and African women's desires have been and really remain frustrated in Canada. You know, as an immigrant myself, first generation immigrant coming from the Caribbean, you know, those of us who have made that journey kind of looking outward from the coastal shores of the Caribbean or continental Africa toward an imagined Canada, see, right, what appears to be this vast expanse of the horizon that's beckoning toward new possibilities away from, you know, maybe small island cultures, um, or African nations and enmeshed in conflict. But the horizon of Canada's promise of a kind of multicultural haven where cultural differences are presumably welcome and where everyone through hard work and perseverance can realize their fullest being is really a mirage that is never quite attainable. So, in this sense, for me, the horizon keeps moving, extending, always just out of reach, deferred to some future, always not yet possibility. You know, history has in fact taught us that nation states like Canada are inherently hostile to Black and Indigenous people's lives. So to be in place as a relationship to the Canadian nation is always already to know one's place as a series of erasures of Black histories and exclusions of Black lives. So diaspora belonging in this sense is really an oxymoron. And in my own writing, I offer a definition of belonging that contests the idea that Black people can even seek recognition from the very white supremacist and settler colonial state that is the site of their oppressions. So I use the verb belong and the noun belonging instead to register Black people's multiple locations in historical time and place, as in the need to be, just to be, not necessarily to participate in any kind of capitalist project, the urgent demand to exist without fear, to be accepted across our differences, and the longing for a moment beyond struggle and loss. On belonging, correspondingly, denotes for me the absence of certain being in time and place, the precarity of self, the frustration of this urgent desire to live beyond loss. So, this definition registers for me the incongruity between Black people's dreaming of an ideal and romanticized homecoming or return and the reality of a recurring catastrophe, a recurring natural and cultural disarticulation that needs redress before belonging can be made possible.
Thank you so much, Professor. If I could pose the same question to you, Ian, how does your writing address your identity or Blackness in the Canadian experience?
There we go. I was trying to unmute myself for a while there. Hi, everyone. Good evening. That was really articulate what Andrea said. So what I hope to do this evening is to think alongside, right? I like how you framed it there, Andrea. So to think and to have some thoughts in process rather than to have something completely worked out. I will say, like, to think about the journey of many Black people, it involves like a three-step process, right? This movement of immigration. There's home, where you started off. There's a journey in the middle. And on the other side, there's this desired place that you hope to end up. And the way Andrea is putting it is like, we never get to that desired place. The horizon keeps getting pushed back. So the journey is the thing that keeps us, we're constantly in the state of journeying or traveling. And we know from, like, if you go backpacking through Europe or whatever, being on a journey for a long period of time is exhausting and tiring. And so we've got this state where we're expected to live as if we are at home, live as if this is our permanent state, but yet we're not equipped with a house or anything. We're hosteling it with a backpack on our backs, as Black people metaphorically, constantly in the state of traveling and journeying towards something that keeps shifting away from us. So in my book, Reproduction, I think about this process in terms of reproduction, in that title word there. And so my concern with a diasporic energy or the immigrant movement is with the patterns that get recycled over time. So when Felicia starts off at the beginning of the novel in the late 70s, an immigrant from the Caribbean lands somewhere in Toronto and quite sort of displaced and disoriented, and then her mother has a heart attack. And so her whole world is thrown into chaos, right? There's no stability. The little room that she's renting in the Christian woman's house, there's no sense of real permanence there for her. And so if we track that beginning state for 40 years and to see what kind of progress one can make when one has no sure footing from the beginning, and the people and the policies that come into place to thwart, to redirect, to use her for their own advantage. And I don't even mean that systemically. I mean like interpersonal relationships. You meet the wrong person and you're completely derailed. And what happens to her kid and the patterns that get reproduced and recycled? And is there any way out of that loop? Any way out of that loop towards a stable footing? And well, the book, I'm not sure if it answers it, right? But the book shows the progress of a life. And I think that's the best we could do, right? The progress of a life.
If I could ask the same question to Jael, how does your identity inform your writing, and how do you address the Black Canadian experience in your writing?
Yeah, it's interesting that you've both shared about a journey, like a travel and a moving. And I was born in Canada, and so I feel like my perspective has been like just a constant searching, like a constant looking and trying to find. The opening line from The Stone Thrower, my first book, which is a memoir, says, for most of my life, I've been watery like an ocean, my blackness deep and disoriented, lost in a place known for cold winters covered in whiteness. And for me, that is how I feel about the Black experience. So, that is, I feel lost, I feel disoriented, I feel like it's winter all the time. There's so much whiteness half the time. And so my writing has been my pursuit of answers, my following the questions that I continue to face over and over again. And so, The Stone Thrower, which was a memoir about my father's life, was very much me trying to look at my father's life and this journey that Ian talked about, looking at his journey as a way to understand why I was here and what it means to be here. And I felt like I had a number of questions about identity and what it means to be Black that I kind of arrived at by the end of that book, but also a series of new questions that sparked Gutter Child, which is a dystopia about systemic racism, to sum it up in like one sentence, which looks at a young woman growing up in a world that's built for her failure and trying to figure out what kinds of choices you make. And for me, that book was about trying to figure out, okay, if I understand who I am as a Black woman in Canada, what does it mean to be a Black woman from Canada in the world? How do I relate to other Black folks from other experiences across the diaspora? And how are we both lost and connected to each other along the way? And so for me, every book that I've written begins with a question that I just continue to pursue. And like Andrew talked about the horizon that just seems to get further away. For me, those are the answers that just seem to get further away. Once I get close enough with the question that I have, there's another question that just keeps moving the goalposts, as they say, back and back and back and back. And so my writing is a pursuit of answers that just seems to unravel more questions.
Thank you, Jael. All of you have given me plenty of food for thought. I immigrated here from Birmingham, England. My grandparents were born in Jamaica, and I've called Canada my home since the age of 8. So the way that I think through my own identity and approach it in writing is always shifting and changing. And there's always this sense of feeling home, but always longing for somewhere else, or not feeling quite at home. And I really love that we tease that out. I guess a question that I'd like to next pose to you next is, what Black Canadian writers inspire your work, or even just a broader question, Black Canadian diasporic writers that you're reading right now? If I could start with Jael.
Great. I was just going to answer all the things that weren't said with the others. You're not supposed to go out of order, Catherine. It's just supposed to keep in a loop. And I just, I benefit on that one. Okay. So I wanted to think about this one carefully. And I was trying to think, for me, I wanted to pose names that maybe you're not as familiar with, or stories that I think are like getting missed in the cracks, or that you might just want to pick up. And one of them, a romance writer, like I think I wanted to bring up stories that we might not think about when we traditionally talk about Black writers. And the one is Jane Igaharo. She's like a new romance writer. And she has this beautiful book called The Tie That Tethers. And it's a Nigerian, I think it's a Nigerian romance story. And then Louisa Onome, she has a book coming out tomorrow called Like Home. She's also a Brampton writer. So actually both of them are. So I do have to give a shout out to Brampton, since we're over 50% of this panel, or what, we make up 60% of the panel. And I also thought, because this group is a group of academics, there's a book I really loved that I think is very much about the university and academia experience. And I recommended it on Q a few years ago. And I feel like there's just like a niche audience for it that I want to know. So Suzanne Mayer, the book is called Dr. Edith Vane and the Hares of Crawley Hall. Dr. Edith Vane and the Hares of Crawley Hall. And it's this weird, horror, dystopia, fun look at what it's like to be in academia, and kind of the story that she poses there. And then I'll also mention Janet Sears as a playwright, because I think it's really important to find plays as well as, and then I also had Cicely Bell Blaine for her poetry, Brown Sugar. Yeah, or not brown sugar, burnt sugar, burning sugar. It's on my desk. I can never put it all together.
Thank you. Professor Davis, if you could share with us some Black Canadian writers that you're reading right now, or just Black diasporic writers at large that you think we should pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Black women writers in particular, it is where I go. I've always gone. Black women writers in the Caribbean, the US, but increasingly in Canada, because their work really centers me. I recognize myself, my location, my relationship to the world. They give me a kind of language to make sense of my being in the world. And, you know, for me, the fiction and poetry, especially of Dion Brand, M. Norbese Philip, Essie Adugian, Nala Hopkinson, but also, like Jael says, you know, the dramatic artistry of Janet Sears, have all provided me not only with a lens through which to imagine a different set of choices than those mandated by, you know, the anti-Black neocolonial capitalist systems, but also the theoretical tools for thinking Blackness. So in my own work, I draw heavily on Black women's poetry and fiction as part of my theoretical framework. Their work allows me to think oppositionally, right, against the grain of racism, classism, and sexism, and even institutions like the academy. So you know, I find the theoretical tools, these theoretical tools are, you know, incredibly empowering in allowing me to enter into my own thinking about Blackness in ways that are unique to the experiences of Black women. And I'm deeply indebted to the words and visions of these women. I see myself as a literary critic, you know, on this panel. I guess that's what I would be. I see myself as a literary critic, as writing in and operating in a tradition that recognizes how much Black women writers have deposited in me, right, for my own survival, but also as a kind of safekeeping. And I feel compelled to honor that. And that is not to take away anything from the work of male writers, you know, and, you know, it's, you know, I value and incorporate the work of Austin Clarke, David Chariandy, Wade Compton, and so on in my teaching, if not so much in my writing. But there is something deeply intimate and personal about my relationship to the words and art of Black women writers.
Thank you, Professor Davis. I'm looking forward to hearing your recommendations, Ian. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what I've heard already here. I will say David Chariandy, they're writers who I think everything they produce is worth paying attention to. And I think David is one of those writers who is gentle and calm and grounded and wise. And you know, these are qualities that we usually associate with the feminine, right? And when we see Black men, instead of going towards like ultra masculinity, building off of the writing of people like Toni Morrison and these kinds of legendary, influential female writers, I think that's actually maybe worth writing a dissertation or something a bit, right? And that is just the kind of foundational role that Black women play in the imagination of Black men, versus the kind of white tradition, which is completely male up until, you know, maybe the 19th century or so. Like, we are just built differently as Black male writers, right? Who we look to and who we revere and who we incorporate and whose voices we absorb. So absolutely critical. So David, I would say, I'll give you some poets. I will say Khnisa Lubrin, in the vein of Dion, and Aisha Sasha John, another poet who is fierce and hard to figure out and to pin down, not because she's difficult or complicated, but because the surface keeps changing, right? So you read it and on the surface, you're like, I recognize those words. This is a pretty simple sentence, and it is a true sentence. And then after a few days, after a few weeks, that sentence starts to become something else. And you realize that you weren't really, you were processing the wrong thing, right? So I'll maybe keep it to those three right now. You get excited when you talk about people, right? And then you can just go off on a tangent, right? But some really great, thoughtful, unique voices in Black literature. Maybe I'll put it in the chat as well, too.
Thank you. I'm going to pose one more question, and then I hope to open up the conversation to the audience. I just wanted to ask a question about the writing process. I'm sure for many people in the audience, it's been difficult trying to write papers, never mind, you know, creating creative works like poetry and writing stories. So I wanted to ask you, how you get through writing a writing block, and if the pandemic perhaps has made it more difficult for you to write. If I could start with Ian this time.
Is the pandemic made it more difficult to write? It's made it more difficult to live, for sure.
Just basics.
Yeah, like very, very simple things about like, getting some fitness into the day and like trying to have 3 meals. And although you're at home, the time has entered into some weird kind of sci-fi universe that I don't even recognize how time behaves anymore on the screen here. So my difficulty, I think when people talk about like the difficulty of writing, they mean like the difficulty of like finding ideas and to sort of get started and stuff. And that's not my issue. Writing is difficult because it is, it takes a long time. It's not very glamorous behind the scenes. And the kind of work that you do is just pure grunt work, right? Moving chunks of this here and there. Is this what I mean to say? This is not clear. Is that the right word? All of that stuff that never really makes it into the final draft. So the process of writing for me is just this process of like constant loss, right? This constant shedding away of drafts and just losing things by the day. That said, I enjoy my mess and I enjoy sort of living and working and sitting in this. And in some ways, the pandemic is a blessing to writers, right? I'm writing things that I would not normally write. I'm thinking in genres that I don't normally think in. And I can feel already, although I don't have the evidence for it, a kind of rewiring that's happening in my brain that I think will take effect in the next project and the project after that. And maybe many of us are feeling this, like just the way we interact and think about the other and think about the world. Something is getting sorted in here that is changing my writing. But I won't know it until I have some distance from it.
Thank you. Professor Davis, if I could ask you the same thing, if writing has been difficult for you and if the pandemic has, given you the conditions to be more creative, or if you're finding it difficult to write?
Yeah, I think like Anne, writing is always difficult, but the desire to write for me has actually increased in a weird kind of way. Like I thought I wouldn't want to sit down. It would be too hard to try to face my thoughts or the words, but the horror of the spring and the summer and then the fall made almost compelled me to the page. Because so that writing in all of its difficulty became a way for me to pour out my rage and my hurt and just to think through, because I felt like if I didn't do that work on the page, then the rest of me might disintegrate. So the words were a way of kind of holding me together, as imperfect as they were. And so that has become really important for me. I also find increasingly that I'm impatient, and with other people speaking for me. Like I don't want people to talk for me anymore. I want to speak my own truth. I want to write it. I want to put it down for myself, for my students, for my son, for whoever or however I imagine my audience. So that writing in the urgency of the moment has almost become a kind of ethical project for me, a kind of personal political project, if that makes any sense.
Yes, thank you. Jael.
Yeah, I have not. So I have privilege in that I don't find the pandemic has been as difficult as the Black Lives Matter movement and conversations. And certainly in combination, they don't really exist well one without the other in terms of 2020 as a context. But I didn't find the pandemic as difficult as I found the Black Lives Matter conversations. And I like what you said about Dr. Davis about just the urgency that I felt. I was finishing up Gutter Child in the spring and writing a dystopia about systemic racism, and then having what was going on was like the hard thing for me was it was changing the story. And I didn't know how much to take in and how much to change and how much to leave and put in something else. And so there were a lot of really hard decisions that had to be made at a really pressing time. And that was probably the most difficult. I don't really believe in writer's block as a thing. I think writers are sometimes writing and sometimes we're thinking and planning for our writing. And so when writer's block happens, it's only if you have a deadline and you're supposed to be in the percolating stage and you're forced into the writing stage. It's the only time I'll kind of like allow for conversations about writer's block. But so I wasn't in a state of not being able to write. I was in a state of not being able to percolate or resolve my writing, if that makes sense. And so the ending of Gutter Child used to have an epilogue. There used to be a neater ending, I should say. And I just felt like I had to take it out, like right before it went to print. And my editor was like, what? That changes the whole story. And I'm like, yeah, maybe. And maybe that's what has to happen. And part of that, I think I felt the need that the story wasn't done and that there needed to be a sequel and there were more questions that I couldn't tie up in a book and give people as a gift that said like, yeah, everything's neat and great. And so that for me was the biggest conflict. How do you, and this is, I said, I should have written the book. It took me 8 years to write the book. I started writing it with Ian in a coffee shop in Brampton, and we would work on it together. It took him much shorter to write his. It took me a few extra years, but I felt like 8 years, the problem with writing over such a long time is that you change so much, and then the work kind of has to change with you. And that last year just felt like the peak, like something big was happening and it was changing me, but I wasn't, like Ian said, I almost needed time to be away from it for a bit to be able to unpack what I was thinking and feeling. And so that was the pressure cooker that made writing a little bit difficult.
Thank you. I'm going to open up questions to the audience. So if you have any questions for all of the panelists or for a specific panelist, please go ahead in the chat and I will go ahead and voice your questions. Oh, I have some great questions here. Okay, let me see. How much does the state of the US affect writers here? What is the connection like, and is there one? This question comes from Christopher Gunn.
I mean, I can say my family is American, so I actually have a deeper understanding of American history than I do of even Canadian history in some ways, because that's the history my family was familiar with, that I was learning. I was going back to when I was learning stories and storytelling and, history. My dad was talking about the Vietnam War and, Lincoln and, reciting all those allegiance and things that they play before football games. Like, what is that? My parents are like reciting it at the same time, like this is my history. And it's actually made for a very difficult process for me in Canada, because most Black Canadians are rooted to somewhere other than Canada and the US. Most of the friends I had growing up. And so, you don't really want to be connected to the US except during the Summer Olympics. And so most of my life was kind of like, I didn't really want to admit it. And then I was kind of ashamed. And then I didn't know what to do with that. And so I struggle because I think it very much informs and influences my work. And I feel resistant to that because of course, when you're here, we're kind of trying to resist it at the same time as taking it in. So it definitely informs my work in ways that I'm not always excited about or proud about, but I also don't have much else to lean on. One of the challenges with Gutter Child, when I went to write the backstory for what happens in this world and how this world becomes, I realized, the only history I'd ever been taught during Black History Month was US, and only up until we arrived in boats as slaves. I had no context that we were kings and queens and, leaders, and, that we shaped the whole like cultivation of land in Africa. I had no connection to any country there, and nobody was teaching me that history in those early years until I was in university and could do a little bit more. But even then I was kind of lost in American history still. And so it's been a real challenge for me, and this book has helped to try and get further into my history and move away just from slavery and the US and all the things that have gone horribly wrong for us there, and to go deeper, further back as far as I can go, in as many places as I can go.
Thank you, Jael. Just to respond briefly to something that you said, I think as a Black Canadian historian, the problem that we have is that there's all these comparisons in looking to the US and looking at, oh, racism is so much worse in the South. This North Star myth of, trying to minimize the history of slavery in Canada. And I think it's important to, think about how the border is porous, but also consider the ways in which the Black Canadian story has its own uniqueness. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
If I could throw the same question to Ian.
I'm wondering if Andrea wants to go first with this question. Or
Yeah, I can start if you want, Ian. I mean, I'm assuming that Christopher was talking a bit about how the events of the spring and the summer and the overwhelming TV media and the election and all of that. And I have to admit, I was bombarded by it. I literally had to wean myself off of TV. I became so depressed. I remember that scene with the protesters in front of the White House, and then Donald Trump going to the church with the upside down Bible, and the peaceful protesters kneeling, and the guards going. And I went to bed. I was depressed. And it's not a matter of even like deflecting and saying, well, this stuff is happening there and it's not happening here, because then I wouldn't be depressed. It would just be like a bad soap opera. But it's because it's so real, and because it impacts all of our lives. And I have family in the US, so although our roots don't necessarily, as far as I know, originate there, so my mom will say, I will say things like, I'm never going to that place, and my mom will be like, but my daughter is there and my grandchildren, you know. So there is this deep connection that crosses these these borders. But what it's done for me, I think, is just energize a moment of change on this side of the border. Like if we say, the bar is so low that, hey, to say that racism is not as bad here than it is in the US is not to say much. So if it energizes us to try and shift the academy, or make some changes here, then that moment is useful, but it's really, really emotionally exhausting.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that emotionally exhausting part, right? There were some days just kind of spent lying on the couch. And of course, how do you explain that, right? How do you say, I'm not grading these papers because I just, of something that I'm watching on TV, or I don't want to do anything today. And it is, although we're not in the States, you realize how quickly you could be any of those stories in the States the minute you cross the border. America doesn't care, like, whether you identify as like Caribbean or Canadian or whatever. Once you've got this complexion on you, suddenly there's just all of this danger there. And I feel that radiation when I'm in the US. And I had a bit of a hard time living there when I did. And so when I watched sort of all throughout 2020, it wasn't an issue of watching something foreign or some kind of, it was not fiction. It was like, hey, on the wrong day, that could have been me, or it could still be like family over there. And so we're constantly connected to it. And this kind of like vacuuming or vortex that America has, that it kind of sucks you in, and just by a virtue of one feature, you are a Black American, you know? So it's this weird kind of force that does not respect border, right? I don't think that anti-Black racism in the US cares particularly about containing racism within that country. It spills out to all of us, and it sucks us all in as kind of implicated in that in that mess.
But I think, well, I was gonna say, I think one of the dangers is that it doesn't just spill over. Like my brother-in-law in 2005 was assaulted by police officers in Mississauga and lost his career. And so for me, I mean, what I saw, that I think one of the things that was most frustrating was the fact that we're taught, you know, we talk about the myth, the things that we're sort of told about what Canada gives and provides is a myth but it puts us in danger. It actually sets us up for danger because we're not expecting it. We believe it's over there and that we're safe over here.
Right.
And when it hits us, there's actually fewer protections as well. In some ways, there's fewer people who even believe it's real,
Right.
you know, so we're in danger because we're unprepared personally, and because all the people around us, who are white in particular, but also I was like this, buy into the myth that we're safe here.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one problem. The other thing, I think as writers, and this is a big shift, but it connects. I think as writers, there is a pressure to appease an American audience, just on a logistical side of it. There's pressure to make the story more relevant to Americans because it's a bigger audience, it's a bigger pool as a writer. And so you actually face like legitimate problems, questions, if you set your story in Toronto versus if you choose to set it in some unknown American city or a known American city. There are literal editors in Canada who are telling you, set this story in the States and you'll more likely to get a deal. And so I think your question, Christopher, just to go back to it, is both complicated, whether we're talking about politics or writing. There is actually like a magnetic pressure that's both pulling and pushing us back and forth across this constructed border.
Thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze one question in from the audience, and then we'll go to a break. A comment/question from Montel Gordon. I studied American and Canadian literature and history in the UK. We looked a lot at Margaret Atwood and a little bit at Thomas King, but no Black Canadian writers. Do you think Black Canadian writers are not regarded as highly as their white counterparts in the education system? Great question.
Oh, I need to make notes.
It's a heartbreaking question for me because it signals that someone that you could do your best work, and just by virtue of like your identity, someone is saying that is not a valuable contribution. And I think we see this happening with Black writers, which is that we do work that might not be mainstream, might be a little bit avant-garde, might be challenging, experimental, even though the mainstream will eventually sort of catch up and whatnot. And that work is almost never regarded as an artistic advancement, right? What people want from us as Black writers is they want a story of race, right? They want a story, they want plot from us. And some of us are not primarily concerned with plot or with giving you a certain kind of story or one kind of story. Some of us are interested in the luxuries that we grant white writers to just kind of advance a discipline, right? And so I find myself doing both, right? I'm talking about things that are important to me and I think are important in the world, but at the same time trying to push forward art and literature. And yeah, I think I would love it if more of the conversation were about how is this Black writer innovative, right? To use that sort of business-like word, right? What is this person doing that, we can teach, like, do we ever teach a Black writer without bringing up like something race related, right? Do we ever bring up a Black writer as an example of here's a sonnet, right? And this is just how a great sonnet is working by a Black writer. Here's a novel that does something really great with point of view and not deal with race. And I'm not saying that any of this to avoid the very important work of race, but to say that we should not be persistently reduced to one element, right? In a way that the authors that you named, Thomas King and Margaret Atwood, have not been.
Do you want to go, Dr. Davis?
You go, Jael.
Okay, you said I could. No, so I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think that the academia is a system. It's a system that has benefited and been built off white supremacy. And so as a result, it feeds itself. It gives itself what it needs to keep growing. And so it has generally fed white writers and kept white writers held up. And writers like Thomas King and Lawrence Hill and, now S.C. Adujan and Ian, they can come through, but it's through a very narrow hole. And it's through a much more difficult hole than it is for their fellow white peers. I'll give you an example. When I went into my master's program for creative writing, 8 of us came out of the program with books, like had written books that were published soon after we came out. I was the only Black writer. All of them were invited to festivals and put on panels and included in conversations. And they said it was because my book was nonfiction and these others were fiction and poetry, but and, they had these writers who were writing books that were like everything you've seen before, and their names were easy to pronounce, and they got tossed around in there, and they got recognition very early on for books that were good, but not, not anything spectacular and not anything different. And that's, their names were on posters for festivals, not just invited to the festivals. They were first debut writers on posters. And there were these things that I could see how the doors were opening wider for them right from the very beginning. And it's one of the reasons I started Fold, because I felt like nobody was going to open the door wider if I didn't do it myself. And so that's, I think that the industry is also very white. It's very familiar with a certain kind of story and storytelling. It knows, publishers know when they get a white woman writing a white woman's story, how much money they're going to make on that book really easily, because they know from past experience, from reading it themselves, there's a familiarity with those kinds of stories. So there's a way of getting out and getting recognition that's much wider. The door, the lane, the path is much wider for white writers than it has been for writers from marginalized communities. And part of that is I don't think there's a real depth and value and understanding in the way that we tell stories and what our stories can do for people who are not just Black. Like, a lot of times they've assumed that our Black stories are only for the Black community and that Black readers are a small group of people that's kind of niche. And they don't realize that Black stories are actually for white readers as well. Even if they're not written for white readers, they can actually read them and they would actually benefit from reading them. And so there's a whole system that feeds one group and kind of starves another group and leads us to kind of like crawl over each other to get to the top. And it's because I think these systems are built on whiteness for whiteness. And when we come in, they don't know what to do with us. And a lot of times we have to make our own space, not just, starting a festival, but also make our own space with our editors. I was talking with Lawrence Hill a few weeks ago about the fact that as we work on books that are about Black identity, we don't often get to work with editors who are Black. And therefore, most times our editors are not familiar with the books that have formed the language, the style, the structure that they're supposed to be helping us edit and shape. And so in the editing process, you're often doing your own kind of navigating, your own pushing that another writer might not do, because they just be like, remember that book by Atwood? Yeah, it's going to be like that, right? And with me, I'm like, remember that book, Sula by Toni Morrison? And my editor's like, I've never read it. And of course, she went and read it, but like, she didn't have that background with her, and she didn't have the other things that I might have needed. And it also happens even in the marketing. I'm sorry to rant, but sometimes in the marketing of books, Black books are marketed a certain way. They're marketed about trauma and devastation and tragedy, because when white folks read our stories, they don't see the joy that comes with tragedy. And so these books get pitched out in the world as these sad, horrible tales. And then people also have to battle that in the world. Why did you write such a sad, horrible story, or a sad, traumatic story? Whereas white writers writing about killing a whole bunch of people, that's not sad and dramatic, that's just entertaining, right? So there's all of these things that are in the system and that make it difficult. And that was a very long answer.
Yeah. I don't know if there's anything more I need to say after that, but I think Black writing in Canada is as much a surprise as Blackness itself is, right? Black writing has existed in this country for 200 years, from slave narratives, to the really exciting experimental work of somebody like Kai Kellogg, right? We've done that 200 years, and yet people are like, Black writers. I think part of the problem is that Can Lit as an institution, right, can only somehow, for some weird reason, hold one Black writer in its mind at a time. So today's, in the 70s, 80s, whatever, it was Austin Clark.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was, then we give Dion every now and then, right? And then it's Essie, or it's Lawrence.
You
Like,
can name them, like how you went down the path,
right, together at the
from
same
1992 to 95.
It's mind blowing for Canadians. And yet there's this enormous rich tradition that is getting even richer. And that's what's so exciting to me, is all these new writers. So yeah, Can Lit needs to whatever.
Can Lit. I always say, though, that we have to talk about the institution of Can Lit versus Can Lit, because we are Can Lit. That's an important thing for us. As Canadians writing in Canada, we are Can Lit. It is our space to occupy. But it is, like many other things, a system that we have to also acknowledge and kind of push aside while we stand in the sun.
Yeah, while we stand in the sun.
Thank you. I am loving the commentary in the chats and such an informative, vital conversation. If we could take 5 minutes break, and we'll come back, and I will for sure incorporate some of the questions that were in the chat in the next round, and try to integrate them into the next theme. Thanks so much. And we'll be back at 6:07, let's say 6:15. We'll start the conversation again.
Thanks so much.
Good evening. We're going to get started with the second half of our conversation, which addresses the Black artist and the future of Black Canadian literature. The first question that I would like to pose is, are you optimistic about the future of Black Canadian literature? I think that's a great follow-up from the ending of our last conversation. If so, what excites you about the future of writing Black Canada? Sorry, and if I could start with Ian this time.
There we go. What's exciting about the future? You know what? So I forget who made the point about sort of the tragedy being wrapped up with the joy. And so the tragedy of 2020, I think it was you, Jael, right? Yeah, the tragedy of 2020 was, that Black Lives Matter needed to be a necessary movement in 2020 at this point in history. But the joy is that we are able now to speak with a kind of freedom that I don't think was possible even like 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's this kind of dropping of all kind of polite artifice and all of that Black folks have needed to do in order to survive, and just being able to demand it to speak freely. And that was made possible this year. And so that, coupled with platforms and that are very powerful and direct between the reader and the writer, like Twitter and social media, means that I am optimistic, like super optimistic about the future of Black writers, because I don't think they will have to pander. I don't think writers younger than me going through systems, I hope that systems will be a little bit more hospitable to them. I hope that they will see people like Andrea in front of their classes, right? So I'm hoping that there's going to be a different outcome because of this revolution that is happening right now. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Jael.
I am cautiously hopeful. I've been thinking a lot about hope lately. A lot of last year I was thinking about hope, and I was thinking a lot about hope in my writing and like how much hope I need to give people and whether any is required. And I am definitely hopeful in the individuals. I'm hopeful in individual writers, and I am hopeful. I do think there's more space that's being created. Sometimes I think it's a temporal space that if it doesn't work out for publishing, it's like a black hole that will just close over time until it's like, well, we did that experiment and it didn't really work out. So I'm a little bit nervous about that. I'm also cautiously hopeful because I think there are more doors open. There are more opportunities for Black writers to get published, but publishing is hard in general. So that isn't like a great, like the door is not wide. I also, the thing that I fear most that I think will impact my ability to be truly hopeful is I'm not sure the industry is actually interested in changing. Right. I'm not sure the industry is actively trying to do the things that are deeply meaningful long term, which is like having more Black editors, having more Black folks at the top level that are making decisions about how money is spent and how marketing is done. I am also, and I think that means that a Black writer going into that space is still a Black writer going into a white space that largely has to constantly defend, prove, argue for themselves quite alone most of the time. The good thing that Ian was talking about is I think we do have, Fold and other places where we have more places to collect, to gather momentum, to speak out about things that are not right, that we didn't have before, and where we might have felt a little bit more isolated and a little bit more alone. I think we have these ways through Twitter and other things of connecting and galvanizing together. So I'm hopeful in that way. I also should say I'm a little bit skeptical of publishing because I find they're not as business savvy as I would like them to be. There needs to be a little bit more sharpness in terms of what they do in order to maximize all the good things that happen too, right? I know I'm probably not making a whole lot of sense with that statement, but sometimes I feel like publishing just shoots things into the dark, just sort of like throws spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks. And I think if they can get a little bit more precise, and I think diversity in their staffing will actually help them do this as well, right? Diversity doesn't just help you check off boxes. You have different kinds of thinkers and different kinds of people who operate differently. And that's what publishing is missing as much as the colors that are missing in publishing. They're missing these different kinds of thinkers. And so if they can get that right, if they can understand that it's not just about acquiring more Black writers, and that it's about building a better infrastructure for all writers. And this is the great thing about Black activism, is when we do work, when we push for things, it makes it better for everybody else. Because when they've been ignoring us, they've been ignoring disabled writers, they've been ignoring queer writers and trans writers. And so when we say, hey, you're doing it wrong, it fixes it, it addresses things for other people.
Yep.
So I'm hopeful for individual writers to have more opportunities, but I'm only cautiously hopeful that publishing really knows what it's doing and how to make it right, not just today to satisfy a few check boxes, but to change the industry for the better long term.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm actually really optimistic.
Mhm.
Just at the constellation of new voices that are out there that I did not see 10 years ago. Right? 10 years ago, it really was like, okay, what's going to happen after Dion Brand dies? Right? But then there's this real emergence of younger writers that I find, very, very hopeful. And of course, I'm sitting on a panel with the both of you. So how can I not be optimistic? But I also think about some of the writers who have published in the last 5 years or so. Zalika Reed Benta's new novel, right? She's kind of like, for me, a contemporary Makeda Silvera. And there's Kenesia Lubrin, who Ian already mentioned, who is just phenomenal and brilliant. And other people, Junie Desale, Cicely Bell Blaine, Jamila Ibrahim, Jane Igaru, who you mentioned, Jael. And one of the things that I hope is happening and that I hope might make a difference, certainly is what I am trying to do in the academy, is to shift this idea that Black studies is somehow naturally located in the social sciences and not in the humanities. So, at York, in the work that I've done in creating a Black Canadian Studies certificate, we've positioned that certificate in the humanities and made Black expressive cultures an integral part of the study of Blackness. So that I'm really trying to center the ideas, the thoughts, the imagination of Black people as being valuable in and of itself, and not as being utilitarian in teaching Canadian society something about Black people or how to solve the problem of Blackness. So I'm hoping that this kind of shift will expose more and more students to, and students, they might come into these courses and they don't know what to expect, but once they're exposed to it, they really, it opens up this entire new way of thinking about the world that they deeply appreciate. So what you do is so important. It's worth those 8 years, of sitting in front of, sitting with those thoughts, because certainly for me, and increasingly for my students, they're a lifeline.
It's funny, I had the same moment where university was where I kind of like, oh, aha. And I realized it's because it's the first time I met Dion Brand and Janet Sears and all these writers. And so one thing that does add a little bit of hope for me, I was yesterday just in a conversation with English language teachers in Ontario about teaching gutter child, and just the kind of enthusiasm that they're trying to infiltrate into a high school level. Because I said, one of the challenges with having these great aha moments in university is it costs a lot of money to have that moment. And that moment really should be coming earlier. And I think that is an opportunity for hope as well. If these conversations and ideas and these points of discussion can happen at a younger age, I think we're more likely to see young readers continue to be older readers, which is one priority for surviving as authors and writers in books, but we're also more likely to have just engaged citizens.
Yeah. Leslie Sanders and I are actually working on an anthology right now to Black Canadian literature with Routledge. So, I'm hoping that that will give teachers,
Yeah.
at that level before they come to university somewhere where they can go and not be surprised.
This is such a generative conversation. Thank you. There's something that Professor Davis alluded to that I wanted to kind of tease out. So how do you think that the university can support Black creatives and writers and provide the infrastructure, the voices of mentorship that are needed to, do the difficult work of writing? And I guess I'll start with Jael.
That's what I was like, definitely not me. You guys are both in academia. You guys both work. I'm like, I am passing that off to you all. I'll come at the end, maybe.
I can start it off if that will make
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So I teach in an interdisciplinary humanities department, and what all of us teaching in the liberal arts, but especially in the humanities, have been pushing back against increasingly over the last 5 years is this pressure on the university to prove that to prove its utilitarian value, that somehow when students come to the university, they're coming to acquire skills, a kind of concrete set of skills that then get translated monetarily, rather than coming to acquire critical thinking, reading skills, knowledge about the world, knowledge about themselves that will then make them engaged citizens. And so, I have certainly in my own work, been pushing back and kind of asking the universities, York University, where I teach, has the largest liberal arts faculty in this country, to really stand up and defend the work that we do, because especially when it comes, like I said before, for me, to Black studies, in certain Black studies and in certain Indigenous studies in the humanities, is a really radical intervention in the academy, and we can't dismantle the systems, institutional systems of racism that exist without paying attention to Black expressive cultures, to Black thought, and to Black ideas. That's where the ideas sit, right? That's where Black people themselves are inventing and reinventing and reimagining themselves. So you can't do that work solely through a sociology essay or through an anthropological text, right? You also have to sit with writers, because they're doing that work of creating and thinking. So I want the university to value, right, to push back against the government, to say that what we do is that empowering students, right? How do you send students out in the world to sit at a board, among other executives, even to think about an ad campaign, when you haven't given them the context to understand even the country or the community or the city in which they live, or how we relate across our differences. So I would like to see more of that acknowledgement, more spaces for residences for writers, more opportunities for mentorship, for writers to mentor, for my students to work with writers, even those who don't necessarily want to go into writing as a career. But I think there is so much to work and so to learn, and so much partnership that could happen. So I want to see a shift just in the way the academy imagines us and imagines itself.
Ian?
Jael? You were scheduled before me. Do you want to go?
Oh, okay, fine. Here I go.
I'll just be really quick at the end.
To be honest, I don't know if I have an answer to this one. I would I would say, yeah, I'm not sure. Honestly, I've spent more time thinking about high schools and what they can do for Black writers, because in my experience, it was far better in university than it was in high school. And so I was much more concerned with the fact that it took me all the way to university to have access to any of those kinds of stories. And how I'm still deeply disturbed that they're doing Shakespeare in high school English classes, and that oftentimes when they're investing in writers, they're investing either in American writers, or, it's been a late move to guarantee even that high schools teach at least one Indigenous author a year. I mean, over the course of a student's high school career, that at least by the time they graduated, they will have read one Indigenous writer. That's been a pressure that we've been putting on them for a long time, that we're moving closer towards. And I think it should be the same for Black Canadian writers, right? So those are the kinds of things that I've been spending most of my time weighing in on and speaking out about, just about the need to be to raise young people who love and appreciate storytelling, that happens at an early age. It happens through spoken word, it happens through poetry, it happens through music lyrics, it happens through books, and that should be the focus of English classes in high school, because I think we're more likely to get strong candidates in the university program if we can develop and foster that love early on. And I think oftentimes students leave high school thinking, I don't really like Canadian literature, or I don't really like reading, either or both, and not understanding like the full spectrum. At Fold, we do this event where in the morning they listen to fiction writers, and in the afternoon they listen to spoken word artists. And I find that over the course of those two events, young people see, oh, stories happen in different ways and different forms, and I like this form better than that form, but I see the value in both. And that's, for me, what I'm like really I'm kind of obsessed with.
A couple of quick points there, and one is really basic, and that's representation. And I think we can simply reflect the world that we live in those power structures, both at the professor level and in the sort of administrative level as well. And reflect it in a way that is not tokenized. So, I mean, the Black academic does not always have to teach Black studies, but the Black academic can teach Shakespeare, and the Asian woman can teach British Lit and can teach George Eliot or what have you, right? So these kinds of things, that what we're qualified to teach has some kind of location in our body, and we're not capable of teaching other things. I think that needs to be dismantled, right? Black, mathematics professors and architecture professors and engineering and all of those fields where we are working invisibly need to sort of be, we need some spotlight there. And the other thing, because I know we've got tons of questions, is that I think universities have to shift their attention to developing capacities that are not just logical and intellectual, but also humane and empathetic and creative. And I think that's a big failing that's happening, right? This value on business, sciences, those kinds of things. It's the point, Andrea, you made beautifully already, so I won't reiterate it. But to realize that there's value in the creative life, in a sort of more introspective and slow producing life that is impossible to grade and to reduce to something as like, what's a B+ in this poem? To have other ways of thinking about what you're doing in this space that don't at the end boil down to a 76.
Thank you. I'm gonna take some questions from the audience. A question that I have written down from actually our first round is, do you write with an audience in mind? And is the Canadian audience receptive to Black Canadian writing?
All right, I skipped the last one going first. I will now take a bullet. No, I'm just kidding. Mostly because I have like a pretty definitive answer to this one. So I was interviewing Eden Robinson a while back, and she told me that with every book, she always has one reader in mind. She always writes every book to one person. It may be someone from her family. It may be someone she's met like in passing. It may be someone she almost knows, but it's always written to one person. And it was really useful to me because I felt a lot of pressure when I was writing the book to be thinking about the reader, this mystical force. And oftentimes there's this question among Black writers, are we writing to Black folks? Or are we writing to white folks? And like, do you cater, pander, whatever it is? And I felt particularly alarmed by this thought because my Black identity has always been kind of this watery, messy situation. And so at times I literally couldn't tell if I was writing for a Black writer or a white writer. I couldn't even decipher who. And so when I nailed it down to the fact that I was writing to myself at 14, that I was writing to that girl that at 14 years old had been reading Civil War romance novels for years and did not see the irony of that at all, and was moving through the world with a kind of privilege, but also a kind of disadvantage that I didn't recognize. When I realized I was writing to that person, it helped shape so many decisions in the book, and just like a clarity that allowed me to remove a lot of that pressure about who I was writing to and who I was writing for and how that was happening. And so that's been a really practical lesson for me. Even in my new book, I haven't quite figured out who I'm writing to, who that person is, but I know that once I figure that out, it's going to be it changes the editing process for me. It makes everything just, I understand what I have to explain and what I don't have to explain, what I need to give more detail and what I can give less detail to. And so that's been a really freeing experience. And I will say this too, I think the Canadian reader is willing to read a lot of different things. Actually, I've seen a lot of openness. I don't think they know how to review or talk about all those things well, necessarily across the board, but I think there is a willingness to consume a variety of stories when they're aware of them and when they're given to them. And back to the conversation about hope, that is a reason to be hopeful. So yeah.
Yeah, there's the danger of the reader is that the reader can become this editorial force in your mind as you're writing, right? So you're not saying the thing that you want to say, you're saying the thing that you hope pleases some other person. And then you introduce this kind of dishonesty into the process, and it's going to fall apart if it's too soon. So my sort of attitude towards the reader is sometimes I zoom in close and sometimes I zoom way out. And when I zoom in close, I imagine someone reading in their bed at night with a glass of water, and they've got to work in the morning, and so you better move through this section quickly, right? It's the middle of the book, you don't want to lose them, right? And sometimes I zoom out really, really far back, and I think I'm writing for someone 50 years from now, and this book is not going to do well right now, but in 50 years that person is going to look back and say, yeah, I think that's the guy that I'm going to unearth, and right? So there's all of these different relations that shift depending on where I am in a project. But it's not one controlling reader. The reader has no control over what I do. And generally, I view the reader as this kind of benevolent and kind person who wants my success and who's with me, like a companion more than an evaluator.
Yeah, I guess, I'm coming from a different place, of course, because I'm not writing fiction. I'm writing, academic material. When I think about the question of audience, I think about an early essay by Norbesi Philip, where she says that she's aware of two writers. There's a writer over her right shoulder who is a white Oxford educated male. And then there's, a reader over her right shoulder that is a white Oxford educated male. And then a reader over her left shoulder who is an old, wizened so wise old Black woman. And when I was working on Horizon Sea Sound, the writer over the reader over my right shoulder that was totally giving me all kinds of chaos was my assumed reviewers, right? These other academics who would have to read and approve and give this work the go ahead. And I just kept second guessing everything I wrote. I couldn't go anywhere because this reader was so overwhelming me. And then at one point it occurred to me that really there wasn't anything I was trying to say in this book that I didn't say, that I wasn't saying every week I stood in front of my students. And so I just started to write to them, and so my students became my audience, and it just opened up this wonderful door and liberated me. And, so I think we have to figure out, I guess, for each of us who opens that door, whether it's an old wise Black woman or for me, my students.
Thank you. I'm gonna try to join together. I got two questions, one from the audience and I guess one of my own. So a question from Kaylee Lynn is, how do you deal with the misrepresentation of your work and your ideas? And I guess a second part to that question would be, how do you deal with those who try to tear down your ideas because you're talking about the myth of multiculturalism or bringing up Canadian racism, which for some is an uncomfortable conversation? And whoever would like to start, I don't want to put anyone on the spot.
Oh, this is a hard one, right? So this is a tough one because just this weekend, I wrote an essay for the Globe and it came out. And it's an essay about driving while Black and the experience that a friend of mine had in Vancouver. And, that evening, the next day, the comments section started to populate. And, so I glanced at it, right? Because, what do like over 100 people need to say about this essay? It's pretty straightforward. And it's the wide spectrum there, right? Some folks are like, yeah, totally, preach on. And other people are like, this is this again, this kind of race talk and what's happening to the Globe and Mail. And this is not the Canada that I know. If this guy was just doing his job, like that kind of thing, right? This kind of nostalgia for some previous idea of what the world should be like. And you know what? It was the essay itself that disturbed me more than the comments, right? Because I felt like I had captured something true about the world and that the comments were just and reinforcing or proving that racism still kind of happens, even in response to talking about race, right? It's this weird kind of thing, like you're pointing out the thing and someone is denying it, but in their denial, they're in fact affirming the thing that you say. And so I don't know. I mean, it does kind of have this kind of emotional kind of wave, like, oh, am I going to do this again? Am I going to write this? Am I going to? But the way that I've settled it, and this is only a day old, this is still pretty fresh. The way that I've settled it is simply, I've done my work, and the conversation about the work or the issue happens outside, and it sort of takes a little bit of the work, but it's bigger than anything I need to manage or control or do anything about. That conversation that happens there. I've only just kind of produced something that people can respond to and talk about.
I think generally I storm around my house and do subtweets for a while. Usually, like I just get really angry and speak loudly about things until I can figure out what's really bothering me. One of the things that's happened lately is in Gutter Child, none of the characters are referred to as Black or white, but a number of white reviewers in particular, and sometimes like just general white folks writing about it, have called the mainlanders white and the gutter folks Black. And I didn't really know why it bothered me so much. I mean, it was a definite decision in the book not to put those labels on them and to use labels like gutter when I wanted to show the negativity that's often assigned to, even in calling us Black, right? That there's this kind of negativity that was placed on us that we now embrace, and we do these positive things with it, but it was not intended for our good. It was not like, and so I wanted a name that showed that negativity, that way that people name us to put us down and to dismiss us, but also to give us a name, our origin name, that would be a positive name. And so I wanted to do these things in language in the book, and I did not want Black or white to be used in any way to describe any person. And yet these reviewers were using Black and white, and it steams me. It gets me like really riled up, and I did not know why. And it's because I think it takes the power dynamic and the language from today and places it inside the story in a way that I'm not comfortable with. And I think that I can't do anything about it, right? Those reviews are out there. People are making assumptions and writing these things, and I can't stop it. I can try and talk about it as much as I can, but it's just a pet peeve. And really what it comes down to is it just shows one of the things I've learned from Suvankum Thamavongsa, who won the Giller this past year. She said, people are constantly telling her that her work is so sad. It's where I have been thinking about this sadness versus joy. And she said, I realize that their statement says more about them than it does about me. And so that's how I try to move away from being so angry and wanting to fix it or tell people how to talk about the book and not at every corner I can. I realize I have to embrace that when people do that, it shows me something about them that they may not want to know and I might not want to see, but it's there. And so that's how I've kind of coped with, what do you do when people misinterpret your work or put labels on it that you don't think take away? And one of the things I was thinking about is, if you're in a classroom and you're talking about characters as being white and black when they're not defined that way in the book, it brings your black students into the conversation in a way that they might not be ready or comfortable. Whereas if they can talk about gutter folks and soci people and mainlanders, it creates a bit of distance in the story. It allows them to make connections in a way that they feel comfortable. And so that's why when I was talking to teachers yesterday, I said, please do not refer to these characters as black or white, because it puts power in their hands in ways that I don't want to be discussed. So I think, mostly I stew, mostly I can't do anything, but part of it is reshaping how I think about them and how I think about the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be very brief. I don't read any comments. I'm not reading them. I don't want to know. I just don't want to take on that heavy work. So I put it out there, and in many ways, I don't have any control, over it after that. And I hope, as I do with my teaching, that maybe that even if 2 people or 3 people or 4 people get it, that might be enough, you know.
Wise words.
Don't
go on Goodreads. That's a good rule to live by as a writer. Never. Don't do it. Nothing good is happening over there.
I wanted to just pose a question about your own writing. The first published piece that you can remember, and how difficult was it to get published? And do you remember, the first piece that you got published and what it was like? If you could go back a few years. Thanks. This is more for, the burgeoning writers in the audience that, there's a few questions that have actually been posed about this, nervous to start the first piece or to pursue this idea of getting published.
I'm looking, okay? Just give me a couple of minutes. Go in the meantime.
I have so many can't remember.
It's been a minute,
I can go first because I'll be really, really quick. And here I guess I'm speaking to like grad students. So the first pieces I published, I were these short author entries for Benet's Reader's Encyclopedia on Louise Bennett, Erna Brodber, Jamaica Kincaid, and Merle Hodge. And it was one of my mentors at York who, was soliciting writers and said, come and do this. And, it's in the kind of job market world, is that, they don't really have any impact, but it was a way for me to get started, to see something done, and then to get it published. So at the time, it was a big deal. I was a PhD student in my early years, not writing the dis yet. So that was really cool for me. So start small, I guess. Don't be afraid of starting small. Your first published thing doesn't have to be your dissertation manuscript, right?
Yeah, so I found it here. The first thing I published academically was in the year 2000 at a U of T magazine. But the first poem that I published, also in the year 2000, was in the Hart House Review, a poem called Gone, that ended up in my first poetry collection that didn't happen until 10 years later, right? So that poem happened in 2000. It was this really minimalist kind of intersection poem. And I remember it. I was so happy for it. I wanted all the copies of the Hard House Review. And that was a big deal. Is what you're saying, Andrea. It was a huge deal for me to say, oh, I made it through some kind of selection process and I've got this poem now. And looking now, first publications, all 5 of them are in university magazines. Hard House Review twice, and the UC Review in 2001. And so, yeah.
Nice.
When I was in undergrad, I was studying theater, and I wrote a play called My Upside Down Black Face, and with Judith Thompson, and I ended up submitting pieces of it, monologues, to an anthology, like by an independent editor. It's called T. Griot, depending on how you pronounce it. And so parts of the play were published in this anthology, and I did not think anything of it at the time. Like, I was excited, but I didn't really know what it meant. I was just like, oh, cool, somebody liked my writing. But what's interesting is I actually used that to apply to grad school to do my MFA in creative writing. And it was going into my MFA in creative writing where I wrote The Stone Thrower as part of it was my thesis. And when I graduated from the MFA, my teacher actually passed my work on to an editor, and that's how The Stone Thrower got published. So The Stone Thrower is my first book, and My Upside Down Face, the excerpts from it, was my first bit of publishing. And so what I would just say to writers who are out there and thinking like, I don't know how to start, I don't know what to do, is to look at these journals and these reviews and these magazines and just wrap your head around small projects, an article, a story, a poem, and getting those published and doing those small steps, going to workshops, whether it's at your school or through festivals or through, whoever's throwing them. Now they're virtual. You could do them like all over the world. Do workshops and things like that help you develop your skill and your craft. Because the more you keep doing and connecting with other writers and writing projects, the more you're going to recognize that the path you're on is very normal. There's lots of other people on it. There's lots of support there. And the more confident you're going to feel that you are, a writer that can do something, because we all can. The difference between writers who are published or not is oftentimes we just kept going. Like, we just kept revising and kept submitting. When the rejections kept coming, we just still kept going. And so it's the key to just keep going and to put yourself around other writers as much as possible.
And I'll add one more thing to that. And this is the idea of like changing your benchmark from publishing something to sharing something. Okay. And changing that word makes a huge difference, because when you're sharing something, you have accomplished it when you give your poem to your friend in your class, right? And you get some feedback from it. So you've accomplished something when you post your poem on Instagram or online or whatever. There are other ways of sharing and getting your work out into the world before you go that traditional path, if that's what interests you.
And publishing is just a different form of sharing too, right? Like it is understanding that you have to share it with someone at some point. So yeah, that's great advice.
Thank you. I have one last question, and then I'll pass the mic back to Emily. I know, writers and creatives, we're sensitive people. So my question is for you. Who do you trust with your writing, with the editing process? And how did you go about seeking that person who you trust your work with?
We trust no one, clearly. Just kidding. I'll start. I'm really quite, I don't know how to describe it. I don't have a lot of confidence in my writing in the first draft. I don't generally know what I'm doing. That's how I feel. And so I rely on other readers and I rely on conversation in order to move through my work. So, Ian, ironically, was a huge part of Gutter Child. He was the first person I shared it with and the first person I ever worked on it with. We're forever bonded as a result. But I feel like it showed me what I needed. I needed to have conversation around my work. I needed to work through that. And even my agent and my editor are really important allies for me because they I've told them, I will give you a work and it probably won't be where it needs to be, but if you tell me what's missing, I will bring you a draft that you did not expect, that's better than you could imagine. And that's just how I write. And I tell my editor that I will give you something, and if you're like, just tell me and I will make it good. And it's not because like I take their word, but I can't tell what it is until someone else reads it back to me, if that makes sense. And so I really rely on my editors mostly, which also makes me kind of nervous, because it means when I'm writing about Black identity, I often don't have a lot of Black voices around the work as I'm working through it. So I'm trying to figure out how to change that. I haven't found like a group that I exchange work with, because I'm not sure I want to do that. Mostly like, I don't know how to do that collectively yet. But ideally, I would have other people who would read it too at various points in the process, so that I wasn't publishing it and giving it to Black people for the first time when it's on a bookshelf.
Yeah, I trust my agent. I trust my editor. I trust they're good folks at Random House and at Coach House as well. Um, yeah, on the individual level, there's some really good people working in publishing, right? I think what we were talking about earlier is a kind of systemic and broader kind of issue with how the industry works. But there are people who give up their lives to read and edit other people's work, and that's a real selfless act that we're grateful for. But I struggled with the question at first. I sort of looked off into the distance, because I think I fundamentally, I trust the work, right? And I don't send it out into the world until I feel like it is sure enough, and I have confidence that it can sort of stand on its own without my protection, right? So I don't, Jael, I'm a little different, right? Like I just don't share things early. I don't share it until I feel like I've realized the thing that I want to do. And trusting the work, and then trusting the people to kind of see what I'm intending to do, that has been a recipe for success, I think, for me so far.
I think I don't give it, it's not super early. I just don't feel it's perfect when I can't work towards perfect. I don't even know what that is.
No, that's frustrating yourself. Yeah.
I don't know if I need to answer this one. I don't work with an editor, right, or an agent, but there are people who I trust, colleagues who I trust to think with me, so to bounce ideas off of, and sometimes to read drafts. It takes a lot of incredible generosity for people to do that, and it's not easy to find those kinds of people. And I know grad students sometimes worry about, well, if I share this idea, somebody might run with it, and so you kind of hold it close to your chest, and so it's a bit of a balancing act, but it's hard to make it in the academy without support and without having a network of people who you can rely on and who think with you.
Sometimes I do, like with Gutter Child, I mean, I was in grad school for Stone Thrower, so I had peers reading different parts of it regularly. And then with Gutter Child, after Ian left me and went to Calgary, I in BC, I actually went to I got a grant to go to a writer retreat. And I found that to be a really helpful part of my process, to go away and be writing on my own, and to be able to workshop, but then disappear. And so I think for me, and I don't know if I'll be able to do it with this next one, I've always really liked like getting my work to a certain point and then going to something like that, so that I can just shut out the family and all the other things that are around me, and also just be in a regular repetition with a group of writers that pour into parts or the whole work. And sometimes your workshop instructor will read the whole thing and give feedback.
Thank you. I've learned so much from you all. I've gleaned so much from the conversation. I'd just like to pass it back to Emily for her to have the final word.
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen very quickly. And I'd like to thank you again, Jael, Ian, and Andrea, for speaking this evening and sharing your knowledge and experiences. I was incredibly happy to learn, Ian, that you were published in the Hard House Review, which you publish. We had an awkward experience with Salika Reed-Benta because she said, I submitted to the review, but you guys denied me. So it's nice to know that we published you. Thank you, Catherine, for moderating the event. And to everyone in this virtual audience space, thank you for dedicating 2 hours to listening and thinking about Black futures and creativity through literature and writing. This event wouldn't have been possible without the support of Hart House, U of T, and members of the Hart House Student Literary and Library Committee. And if you'd like to learn more about the Black Futures programming, I encourage you to visit the Hart House website and the Hart House Student Literary and Library Committee's website, where you can also watch a recording of our past event in honor of Black History Month and the 3rd anniversary of Marvel's The Black Panther, called The World Building of Wakanda. And Hart House will be holding their annual Exploring Black and Indigenous Futurism event on Wednesday, February 24th from 4 to 6 p.m. And more information on that is available through the Hart House website. And you can also attend our next event, How to Find a Literary Agent, on Monday, March 22nd from 7 to 9 p.m. And I'd also like to spotlight very quickly a new permanent online exhibition at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library called Celebrating Black Voices. So on behalf of myself and Hart House, I wish everyone a good night, a good rest of the week, and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.